Okay, so my first question for you is just around how you initially started your career in the built environment sector, and what have you done since then?
That's a big question, but I started when I finished uni. I did a interdisciplinary art and design course, which is fairly kind of broad based, but really kind of embedded methods and processes for interdisciplinary practice. My first job was for a public artist in a public art studio. So we were designing and making sculptural pieces, kind of playful kind of pieces for public realm interventions, typically as part of larger urban developments. Those briefs usually came as part of the kind of community engagement package that any developer had to deliver. So it was usually down to us to engage with residents, with neighbouring communities on around these new developments, and it was a pretty frustrating process because residents care about the kind of things that are important to them, which is typically, kind of parking, bins, street lighting, what their houses are going to look like. So kind of having that conversation when all of those decisions had been made, and you're trying to have a conversation about, yes, but what would you like this sculpture to look like, was pretty frustrating, and led me to kind of pursue an interest in kind of the way in which residents and communities are able to influence and impact their built environment and the cities around them. So from there, I worked in various different projects around kind of public realm, public space design. Did a postgrad in urban design, and did various jobs in the UK and overseas, predominantly in kind of universities and public sector, before starting my two current positions, one of which is the Senior Project Advisor at Communityled Housing London, and the other is an associate for an architecture charity called Architecture Sans Frontières. So similar kind of objectives. That's a kind of social justice charity, working with vulnerable at-risk groups to kind of empower them in processes of urban change, both in the UK and overseas.
Brilliant.
That's a very quick overview.
Yeah, well, it sounds really interesting, and I think that it's interesting to think about, sort of these projects that you do, and you kind of have a preconception about how it might go, and sometimes it just goes completely different to how you might expect. So and as you were saying earlier, your career's been quite interdisciplinary, so you haven't just focused on aspects like urban design, but also other built environment specialisms. How important do you think that's been to the success of your career?
Well, it assumes I have a successful career. Well, I think it's pretty too early to say. I think what it's mostly done is given me a kind of ongoing identity crisis. But as well, I think interdisciplinarity is incredibly important. I think I wouldn't be doing the work I'd be doing now.
Sure.
I think it's my as I've kind of progressed in the jobs I've done, I've kind of slowly come around to the kind of realization that the kind of actual design and drafting of our built environment is, for me anyway, kind of less important than the kind of conversations and the connections that are made in the production of our cities. And so I think in order to kind of to have those conversations and to in an empathetic way to to understand the kind of pressures and priorities from different disciplines is vital in being able to kind of bring people together and have those conversations in a productive and meaningful way. So for me, it's been as much, if not more, about kind of networking and bringing people together and having conversations that they can then kind of go on to kind of create more just, equitable and kind of meaningful places.
Sure. And setting out in your career, did you think that that would be the most important thing to your career, if that makes sense?
No, I didn't. I thought I wanted to make stuff, actually. I enjoyed making things, and it was during working with in public art, kind of realizing that as much as I enjoyed the kind of physicality of designing and building, the decisions that were being made were not those by the people who were doing that making. The decisions were made kind of much earlier up the kind of up the chain, and so the kind of through the kind of different jobs I've kind of ended up doing have been kind of trying to trace that decision making process. To kind of find out, to find the point at which kind of control is held, and at that point to try and broaden out that conversation so that as many people as possible are having input to those decisions and that decision making process.
Sure. Yeah, brilliant. And just moving on a bit more to where community-led housing kind of fits into the sector. I have to admit, I'd heard little about the community-led sector before. So what role does community-led housing London play in the community-led housing sector, and what does the sector more widely involve?
So Community-Led Housing London is one of a number of what's called regional enabling hubs. So there are several of these across the country. They are or have until recently been entirely government funded. So there was a community housing fund. It was set up by government to fund both the kind of revenue and capital funding for community-led housing projects. So the kind of doing the work and then the kind of the building of the homes themselves. In London, we as the Community-Led Housing Hub administer part of that grant money. So we are the the enabling hub for London, and our role covers various different aspects of that process. So personally, my role is typically split between supporting emerging community groups to develop their ideas, refine their proposals, refine their kind of organizational structure, and kind of building their capacity and skills to enable them to client services such as architects, kind of lawyers, financial services, this kind of thing. And on the other side, I work closely with local authorities to support them on kind of the supply side of support and most importantly land, specifically for community-led housing. So I guess you could kind of frame it in terms of supply and demand. We kind of take a kind of an enabling role on both sides, both kind of building the capacity and skills of groups involved in the kind of demand to build the demand for community-led housing, and going through the same kind of process almost with organisations and groups on the supply side, which could be local authorities, it could be developers, housing associations that have the kind of organisational capacity and the kind of skills and finance to support those organisations and those communities.
I see. And why do you think there's a demand now among, like you said, communities and local authorities and developers to, create these community-led housing developments?
I think it's been a kind of chicken and egg situation between some really kind of trailblazing projects, some projects that have kind of really persisted to deliver something different that the market doesn't provide. Fundamentally, I think that's what's at the kind of the crux of community-led housing. It's recognizing that the housing market as it stands, provides for really a very narrow kind of demographic, very narrow idea of how we should be living our lives. It assumes that everyone goes through this process of kind of living singly in an apartment, growing older, kind of having 2.4 children in a house in the suburbs, and then getting older, moving into a retirement home. And for lots of people, and I'd argue for kind of the majority of people, while that may be the only option that's open to you, there are much better ways of doing it. So it's partly a reaction to the kind of the lack of choice, and the restrictions that the housing market puts on people's lifestyles, and aspirations. And why that's happening now is because there have been some really kind of key successes in the form of some projects that have really kind of led the way and demonstrated what those alternatives can look like, and demonstrated that those alternatives are viable. To pick out a few, Lilac in Leeds, Ouch, Older Women's Co-housing Group in London, and the RUS, Rural Urban Synthesis Society, in South London, just as a few. But where it was maybe 10 years ago, you'd have to point to maybe a couple of examples in Scandinavia and the States to look at, to find examples of these kinds of alternatives existing. 5 years ago, you could have pointed to kind of maybe one example in London, one in Bristol, one in Leeds, and now you can look around London, and you can find all of these different examples. There's a kind of growing number, and that's been spurred on in part by the kind of the publicity that these kind of key projects have had, but also by the funding that's been made available. It's made that process of forming a group, of developing your ideas, and of securing a site and securing finance far more accessible than it previously had been.
Interesting. And do you think that from your experience, is there specific demographics who have come to Community-Led Housing London who have felt as if their needs aren't represented in the market?
Lots of groups come to us whose needs aren't met. I think it's often kind of supposed that community-led housing kind of only kind of applies to a certain kind of wealthier demographic, and it's certainly true, and has been true, and is still to some extent true, that there are financial barriers to achieving community-led housing. There are examples that do kind of buck that trend. But it's still, given while there is financial support available, the level of support isn't enough to kind of meet those in acute housing need. Typically, though there are examples that are challenging that. So I think that one of the reasons that it has had a kind of a narrower demographic in the past has been really a result of the demands that taking on a community-led housing project require. It requires free time, it's previously required a lot of capital funding to put into a project, which is a luxury that not everyone has.
Yeah.
The role that we kind of see ourselves having as a hub is to kind of improve the accessibility of the house building process to as broad a demographic as possible. And that's definitely happening. We're seeing much more diverse groups kind of taking projects forward, securing sites, and developing homes. It's not as broad as we'd like it to be, but it's a massive improvement on over, say, the last 10 years.
Right. Yeah, I could see definitely from just looking at your website, there was a massive variety of kind of different projects catering to a lot of different needs. So yeah, it definitely seems as though it's heading in that direction, hopefully. And just talking about, you spoke briefly about some projects that have kind of been pioneering in this kind of community-led housing sector. This might be quite a difficult question, but can you tell me about the most inspiring community-led housing project you've worked on to date?
That is a difficult question. And no, I couldn't pick one. I could probably pick two or three, and for different reasons, because I think, you know, community-led housing it's really just another form of housing delivery, and it doesn't result in kind of one type of thing. So all of the different projects have very different kind of merits. We're working with one group in Croydon who are a group of single mothers who kind of organise locally. They're all living in temporary accommodation. They've developed a kind of a incredibly strong support network over many years. And made the step recently to address their housing situation head on. We worked with them to kind of develop a bid for a site that was being released in Croydon. They actually came second, but through that process have kind of gained a huge amount of knowledge and are now using that to good effect in the borough, and are kind of setting up a housing cooperative for kind of people in acute housing need in Croydon. Another one is they're called LOLC, it's the London Older Lesbian Co-housing Group, and borrowing kind of some of the kind of ideas from Ouch in Barnet. This idea of kind of it's kind of housing for in old age does not have to be the standard model of care that and kind of marketized, financialized care that we see in the UK. And that there's an incredible kind of value in kind of people living a more cooperative and kind of mutually supportive way of life. And one of the reasons that's kind of become an interesting project as well is that they're working quite closely with one of London's largest housing associations as one of those kind of enabling forces to really help them kind of progress that project. So there's innovation kind of both in the approach of the group there, but also in the kind of wider development sector, kind of taking kind of supporting that process and really seeing the value in doing that, in developing a kind of a different type of housing typology for that demographic.
And do you generally find that housing associations and local authorities, are they becoming increasingly responsive to the demand that is there and the need that is there?
Yeah, it's a mixed bag. Some more than others. Local authorities, particularly, it's interesting how the community-led housing kind of agenda can appeal to different sides of the political spectrum. You know, on the left, it appeals for its kind of public land for public good. There's a kind of collectivism approach that's very appealing. And on the right, it's almost quite anti-state. It's people doing it for themselves. So it's not the case that kind of the different boroughs kind of take up depending on their kind of political kind of persuasions. But that being said, there are boroughs that have kind of really grasped it, and are kind of leading by example, and that's having a knock-on effect. So the number of boroughs that are kind of taking up programs and looking at kind of site releases for small sites in a more kind of programmatic way is growing, rather than previously where individual groups would have to kind of petition and negotiate on a site-by-site basis, using both kind of their resources and the councils, and similarly with housing associations. I think it's all about kind of breaking down those kind of barriers of understanding kind of actually what is a community-led housing project, which fundamentally is just another housing project, just with a different client. I think there's a lot of this kind of industry at large is kind of held back by kind of preconceptions of kind of what it's like to work with a community organisation. And there are differences, but they're often, I think, not as stark as they might appear to be.
Sure. And do you think that a lot of local authorities see community-led housing as a good way to kind of help the housing situation and deliver housing, which is obviously really needed in London?
That's a good question. I think I think it presents an opportunity to deliver something different and to kind of meet certain needs. Given with the kind of restrictions being relaxed on local authority borrowing and also the ability to set up local authority-led development companies. There is a much stronger emphasis on councils building their homes themselves, which has kind of limited the community-led housing sector to kind of the smaller sites that perhaps council operations can't make viable, just because of the kind of scale of operation that they're used to. But it certainly does kind of tie into kind of a lot of the political aspirations that boroughs have, such as kind of housing their own residents, delivering affordable housing, kind of meeting specific needs that potentially more kind of generic house building operations don't meet. So yeah, there's the benefits kind of seem to change from borough to borough depending on kind of what the particular needs are. Yeah,
sure. And obviously the kind of nature of those developments that you're talking about, you've said that, you know, boroughs are dealing with a different client. And do you think that if the community is leading the development and then going on to live in the housing, do you think that brings a benefit to the housing itself? If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the benefits you could be seen in kind of two parts. There's a benefit to being a community leading the design and planning and building of their homes. It's not just that they're kind of building them for themselves as individuals, but by having an approach which is focused around the needs of the residents, rather than just the kind of the needs for a financial return, always create better homes. And the kind of the better the design of the home, the more sustainable it is, because the longer it'll be here, the more people will want to live in it. And similarly, in the live stage, when people are when residents are living in those homes, having control over the ownership, management, governance of those homes, addresses all sorts of problems around maintenance. It might not be that they take all that responsibility themselves, but the fact that they're in control of it again adds to the longevity of those of the homes, and also often the degree to which the benefits are held in perpetuity. So that could be affordability, for example.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. And just to sum up what we've been talking about a bit, do you think that the community-led housing sector as a whole can influence the built environment sector more widely? Do you think that's already happening? You've already said that local authorities are looking at housing delivery in a bit of a different way, but do you think that's going to influence how developers look at housing? Or do you think it's going to stay quite isolated as its own sector?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it'll be interesting to see. I think community-led housing, as it currently exists, is I would hope is seen in 10 years' time as one form of it. I hope that what it actually instills is a more progressive, resident-centered approach to larger scale housing delivery as well.
Yeah.
It might be, I think it's certainly diversifying the things around typology. It's diversifying how we think about aspects such as care. That could be older person's care, child care, care in general. The ideas around that co-housing extols, for example, really challenges this idea that we all have to live in our own self-defined castle, and we're all out against each other. So which really serves the market narrative. So I think, yes, it is already having an impact in those terms, and also in ideas of ideas control, and ideas around affordability. The CLT movement and London CLT in London have really changed the narrative around what affordability means by setting their affordability at, for example, a third of average incomes, which challenges a lot of market products, affordable products, and so it is raising aspirations, raising expectations for what people want from their homes, which is beginning to have a knock-on effect. So yes, I think the changes will be many, and it won't be that it will just grow in the way that it exists now, but that it will have impacts across larger forms of housing delivery as well.
And I think it's an important message, even just showing residents that they can influence the places that they live in, rather than feeling like it's a specialism that they can't involve themselves in whatsoever. I think it's important to show people that they can be involved in the conversation.
Yeah, exactly, and giving people a choice about what parts of the conversation they want to be involved with. It's fairly it's understandable that not everyone wants to be involved in selecting the exact material for your drain piping, or commissioning tax advisors. But you may want to have control over the design of and layout of your homes, over the allocations and who lives there, over the long-term governance of those homes. Absolutely. So it's about having the choice and being able to say what aspects of this process do you want control of.
Yeah.
And what are the values that come from that.
Yeah, brilliant. And I think we've already covered this a bit, but thinking about the built environment sector as a whole, what is one thing that you're determined to change?
Oh God. That's a question I should have read beforehand. I don't know. It's too big a question. The built environment sector
It
as
is
a
a big
whole.
question. Don't worry, we can move on to the next one.
No, well, I think in terms of housing, the thing that really kind of needs to change, and maybe this you're kind of coming onto this, is access to finance is one of the biggest barriers at the moment, particularly around in community-led housing. It's the availability of funding and finance. That it's a very small pool of kind of finances that are used to and kind of set up to fund the relatively small amount of finance that these groups need. But it's that pool is relatively small compared to kind of how much the sector can grow. I think in terms of the kind of wider kind of built environment sector, I'd say it's more about the kind of appreciation of kind of resident needs in our most kind of in acute housing needs, and kind of equipping councils and local authorities with the tools to be able to bridge the gap between those most in need and those kind of living comfortably within our cities. The inequality in terms of our built environment, the homes that we live in, the rights that we have or don't have, particularly as tenants. Tenant rights and affordability are kind of are changing the cities we live in a really negative way. So I think kind of, and it not only empower. It's not about really kind of only empowering those residents, but it's about empowering local authorities to kind of to meet the needs that they're kind of mandated to meet.
Of course. Brilliant. And just a final question now. What advice would you give to the next generation of planners, architects, consultants, urban designers, everyone?
Well, it's kind of easy for me to say, kind of take go and do something that is kind of outside of the kind of comfort zone of what your practice is, because it's kind of all I've known, and sometimes I think it would be really nice to have just done one thing and become very good at it. But I think the dangers that come from disciplines not having a kind of understanding or not being able to kind of think empathetically about how not only kind of other sectors and industries operate, but about how their clients operate and how the end users kind of experience that work. I think so. Yes, kind of instill more kind of interdisciplinary practice in if not through your kind of professional practice, then outside of that. I think it'll be ever richer.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's something that universities are trying to do more and more. I know that during my masters, I did a lot more kind of interdisciplinary projects with different courses, which I found really useful. But yeah, I think it's definitely the way that people think about their profession is very narrow-minded sometimes, and it's important to see how that links into different professions, not just your own specialism.
Yeah, absolutely.